Hello and welcome to a new series of conversations and discussions about development design. This is 3D, the Development Design Digest, where we talk with leading thinkers and doers in development, particularly rural development, and particularly those with a design approach to solving problems. But what does that mean, having a design approach? Well, I'm joined by and with here today with André Nogueira, a leading solution designer. André is the CEO of LEAP, a development design practice, and he is also an associate faculty of design knowledge at the Johns Hopkins School of Nursing, where he is the founding director of the design nucleus. And that's not enough, because he also holds a senior research scientist position at Brown University's School of Public Health. And did I mention that he comes from Brazil? So, André, thank you very much for joining us on 3D, the Development Design Digest. Before we get into what a South American is doing, working in North America, and now has to what you have to do with India, I want to first just begin with design and what design is. Because admittedly, I think a lot of us, when we hear the word design, we think of an interior designer, we think of a graphic designer, maybe somebody who's designed a nice chair, fashion designer. Maybe some people have an idea that it's something to do with project management, as that has evolved in different terms. But I'm not sure that a lot of people connect design and development. So can you just dig in a little to what design is?
Sure. Well, I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me here. This is exciting just to have this conversation here in this beautiful day. So design is about making and using things. If we think about it today, design evolved from this informal practice of making stuff for ourselves, make stuff for others, and then we moved into this organizational structure of making things, and that started to distance people, the makers, from the users, right? But that also allowed or required us to start codifying that practice. Before, design was an informal practice. So knowledge about how to make things will pass through generations.
Making the chair.
Making the
Carpenter.
chair, making the shoes, right? The son of a shoemaker would be a shoemaker. So over years, you will learn how to make shoes and eventually develop new technology if new materials was discovered, if new tools were developed by others in the village that they were living in. And that is how knowledge about how to make things evolved.
Right.
Now, once we started separating the maker and the user, and we had to produce more things, mostly during and after the Industrial Revolution. The technology came, our production capabilities increased, we had to specialize to become more efficient, and that knowledge just started to be codified. At that time, also that arts and crafts knowledge started to be paired with the industrialists.
Okay.
And that's where industrial design emerged, is when you pair these two. But at that moment, also the field of design emerged. So there was a practice, how to make things, and there was a body of knowledge that started to evolve. So now, when you ask what is design, I would say there is a practice side of design, which is making things, knowledge about how to make, and ability to make, capabilities to use materials, different tools, to produce different types of things. We might produce objects, we might produce environments, messages, services.
So what you're saying is the codification is a good thing, but interestingly, isn't the classic example that a bunch of men in boardrooms or workshops were designing kitchens predominantly used by women, and they weren't fitting. Like we all, we know the broom is not right. We know the cabinet and the counter is not at the right size. Is that the classic?
That is exactly where the distance between the makers and the users get manifested, right? So there is a group of people, and for some reason, for many reasons. This group of people has been dominant by males, predominantly white males, um, making things for a population that goes by on their daily lives completely different from those we're making, right? So that distance between the maker and the user is where it got us to a bunch of problems that we have today, right? There is research in the beginning of the 1990s where basically 80% of the electronics being sold in the United States would fail in people's homes. So imagine you're buying, a washing machine, a coffee machine, a TV, a phone, and I don't know, a blender, and only the phone works.
That's crazy. Really, so that was the hit rate.
Yeah, that was, or people, it would not function well, or people did not know how to use.
Interesting.
Because that people would not understand who they're making for.
Okay.
There was the decision about what was being made was predominantly defined by the capability of the producer. What can I do? Do I have the technology to produce these things? The interest of the organization with the belief of the more I produce, the more I sell. The emergence of new markets with the global economy and the opportunity to conquer, and that was the term that was mostly used at the time, new markets.
Interesting.
And so that got us to the overproduction mode that we have today, but it also got us to a phenomena that Patrick Whitney, the former dean of the Institute of Design and one of the founding fathers of human-centered and strategic design, call it the innovation gap.
Okay.
And where he says, basically organizations develop knowledge about how to produce and how to sell things at a different rate than their knowledge about who are they making for. And that gives them the feeling of, or the challenge of knowing basically how to make and sell anything, but not knowing what to make. Because they can make any chairs, but which chair should they be making? They can make any toothpaste, but which toothpaste should they be making?
So this is, thank you. This is all really practical and tangible examples that I think we can all get our head around. But how on earth does this come to development? I mean, we think of development as such a sort of field of its own, the social sector. They do things their own way, they talk their own way, write their own way. How does something as practical as what you're saying come into development work?
Oh, definitely. I think that there's a huge opportunity, really still underexplored. So I think that there is a lot of, there's a big learning journey, I think, from a development sector and from a design sector in terms of how can these two evolving body of work be merged or intersect and even create new areas of expertise. My understanding of the development sector is that it has evolved like many other sectors in the 20th century, which is siloed and deeply specialized, focused on efficiency. And that is great.
Oh, sounds admirable.
Right? And
specialist.
Yeah, specialization. And what is also in the development is that they are mission driven. Most of the people in the development are focused on better serving and contributing to the evolution of society in a positive way, which I think it's also admirable.
Absolutely.
And which is a lot what it can teach to the world in many ways.
Interesting.
But that siloification, if you will, of development initiatives worked well when people had fewer options in their lives. So if I only have one option of tuberculosis screening,
Mm-hmm.
then any possibility of accessing that is great. Now, when I have 3 options of tuberculosis screening, 4 options of malaria, 10 options of diabetes, which one do I go? Do I need to go to the 3 of them? Why is it one at 9 in the morning, the other one at 3 on Monday, the other one is on Tuesday? They say it's once a month, but
Different times?
different times, different places. So the development sector, while really well intentioned, faces similar challenges that other sectors because the type of knowledge that it acquired was predominantly informed by the same principles that guided the development of the corporate world, the education world, the policy world, which is specialization, focused, efficiency.
Right.
And that worked well for a period of time. And I think that now we are learning that a lot of our complex challenges and the complex challenges that people face in their daily life, they are intertwined.
And another non-development example is the classic one of the road being dug up for the cable people, and then a week later for the water department, and then 6 months down the line is being dug up for something else. Why couldn't they all coordinate?
Well, that is exactly the element of how what you're just describing now, which is, I think it's fantastic because it's a very common example in all over the world, right? Yeah. And as this idea of how that siloification or the development of that specialization and the embeddedness of that specialization in the how we worked in our lives, in how we worked, how our organizations are structured, also gets translated into the operational part of things. And when that gets manifested, it becomes very obvious to see where opportunities for better investments come. So the trade-offs of not doing this earlier on in the process, right? That understanding of where these different efforts overlap financially, right? You can easily see because now you are spending more digging, and then you just have to spend again covering. But the challenge there also is that each one of these departments, if you will, the energy, the water, all of these different utilities, they will all have their own budgets, their own timelines. So if I've done my part, now it's your turn to use your budget to do whatever you need to do.
So a design approach is having that bird's eye view and getting everybody to talk to each other.
That is definitely one element of it.
So can you give me another example of how this might work? We've thrown about a few practical ones, but how does it work now bringing this sort of design approach to solve this problem?
So I'll give you one example from my home country, Brazil.
Awesome.
So a good friend of mine and also a fantastic professional, Fernando Melo, he has been a practitioner for his entire life, and he was surprised with the invitation to lead the urban development department of a city like São Paulo. So 22 million people in the greater metropolitan area. Huge challenge. More people than some countries.
Absolutely.
So And he was tasked with no small challenge than helping control the informal urban sprawl. So a lot of urban development is done through private sector,
Mm-hmm.
and that gets driven then by market forces,
Mm-hmm.
not by the quality of the urban environment, the improvement of people's lives. Sure, there are these aspects into the design of things, but the driving force behind is predominantly market forces, price of the land, cost of building, um, anticipation of units, revenue per unit, and so forth. So what that does to a city like São Paulo is that a lot of private developers buy a lot of land in the outskirts
Okay.
of the city, leaving a lot of voids in many different areas of the
Right.
cities. Now, that pushes infrastructural development to the outskirts.
Okay.
So they need to build roads, they need to build utility services, and etc. So that people that buy their units in the outskirts of the city are able to get to the infrastructure that it's laying at the core in the core of the city. Now that also pushes all the other aspects of daily lives, services, um, uh, shops, and etc. And of course, people want to live closer there to where they work. So what that ended up happening, what the result of this situation is that there's development, then there is a bunch of informal settlements that get placed around these development areas of people that
To
are
fill those
working,
gaps.
yeah, and people that are working in these for the people living in there,
Yep.
but they do not have either the purchasing power or even the possibility, because they might not represent a attractive segment in the market.
Okay. So how did these gaps get filled?
So then they ended up occupying often areas like mangroves, who are ecologically problematic to be occupied. They are not only of high risk with regards to the quality of the habitation, so the soil is not the best for building, etc., but also for the environment, right? Mangroves are critical ecosystems for our fast-changing planet. So that's the task that Fernando had, and when Fernando and his team started working and looking at the outskirts, they started to realize that one of the driving force for that was the value of the land, and that a bunch of small farmers were sitting in the outskirts of the city, just waiting for their land to be bought
Right.
At
a good price,
good enough price that will improve their quality of life. So they would not invest in the land, would not invest in production, because they knew that that offer was coming.
They just wanted to sell it off.
So that leaves a huge untapped economic potential that could benefit the farmer, the people that would eat their food, the families, and etc. In the hopes that that's going to change. But when change came, when the offer came, they would sell and move to even further, right?
Okay.
So it becomes a reinforcing loop. So what Fernando basically realized was that he needed to connect efforts from the urban development sector with efforts from the agricultural sector, who was interested in incentivizing local farming, urban production, to serve high demand of local restaurants. Now, high demand of local restaurants is also presents high vulnerability in market. So that was not giving farmers enough security to invest in their land. So what they did then was connected farmers' production with public schools, because that is a constant demand.
Absolutely.
And there was budget in the public school, who was to bring more organic, healthy, nutritious food for children enroll in that school. So you can start seeing how these dots from these different departments. So school had a budget for organic local production. Agriculture had a budget for incentivizing local farmers. Urban development had a budget to control urban sprawl. So these things were not connected, but when they came together, they all formed a system which was named Connected Dots, and that changed policy, that won awards, and now there's a whole shift towards understanding even the plan of the city in response to that understanding. So
let's bring this to rural India, rural development. Where does design come into trying to solve some of those problems in a practical way?
So I think that there are specific design capabilities that can add value to existing practices. So for example, visual communication. How do you translate a policy or a scheme into accessible manner so that people understand what that is about, people understand how they can be part of, and if that's even for them, right? So that's still sort of like that. We've developed something, now we need to translate to you, and then design can help in that space. Design can help earlier on in saying, through design research, for example, observation, it can help inform what that scheme might be even in the first place. How do people go about their daily lives? How do you understand how to situate, for example, interventions on medication adherence, help people take their medications on their daily lives, not by just telling them you need to take 3 times a day and you're expected to do that because we all forget. How do you understand patterns of like people wake up, they go to the bathroom, they wash their face, they change their clothes, then they go prepare their food.
And those patterns might be different state by state, or
definitely
of people versus another group of people.
Yeah, by gender, by age, by types of activities that they go in their daily life, by aspiration. I aspire to become a DJ. My life is going to be very different from those who aspire to become a farmer. Right? And so understanding, but there are patterns. And I think that that is where design can help in many ways, shaping that. Now this is, again, it's bringing existing design expertise into the current landscape of development. Now, there's also, if we think about how to even blow the box and think about development in a different way, right? A lot of the approaches that we've seen in development looks at people as beneficiaries. So what that does is bring a needs approach. What are the needs that we need to solve in here? So it's a deficit lens in many ways.
Interesting.
What are the problems that we need to solve? Let's solve this problem. If you think about it in a very practical way, is a recommendation, for example, for people who are experiencing or going through a period of substance abuse, whether this is alcohol, which is increasingly prevalent here in rural India, or tobacco. What do people expect? Stop smoking, stop drinking. That's a problem that they need to address. But then do what? Right? They smoke and they drink because there's something behind that need, but there's also something ahead of the need. Where do they want to go? What do they want for their lives? And how do we boost that understanding that there's so much you can do to provide support, whether through schemes, through programs, through services. There's another element of that that needs to be recognized, which is people's agencies. They decide what they want for themselves ultimately, right? And I think that if we are able, through the development sector, see people as agents of their own solutions, then we start thinking development differently and start bringing them as key stakeholders designing the systems themselves. So rather than providing specific solutions to specific needs, we might create, and that's actually happening, we start to open up the box a little bit of the silos and the development approaches to invite stakeholders that are not considered creators of solutions, but rather beneficiaries of solutions, into designing interventions themselves. And of course, that will likely increase the probability of adoption.
That's right. They have, as you say, a stake in it. Because they've helped create it.
Of course.
And they've been listened to.
And they have that knowledge,
Yeah.
right? So I think that is but that requires, one, the recognition of them,
right,
and the recognition of that lived experience,
right,
as a fundamental source of expertise in shaping. So I'll give an example here in India. We were working with tuberculosis, and there's an interesting phenomenon in tuberculosis where knowledge about tuberculosis treatment exists for more than 4 or 5 decades. Okay. We know the medication, we know how to distribute, how to produce, we know side effects, we know the journey of taking care of, we know different types of TBs, we know the trade-offs that patients might have to do. Yet, there's a phenomena what they call the cascade of care, where every stage of that process, there's a huge dropout. And you ended up with something between 18 to 28% of success rate, which is fairly low for something that we already have a lot of knowledge on.
Yeah.
So a fundamental challenge there is that approach of beneficiary lens and needs-based as a brings the underlying principles for tuberculosis challenges still here in India. And when we started working with organizations within that space, we learned 2 things basically. One was that there is a much broader dimension of people's lives than only the tuberculosis. So there's a bunch of behavioral, social, cultural, emotional, spiritual aspects that inform the treatment, that those delivering the treatment were not considering. They knew about it, but they were not considering. They thought that was not their problem. Their problem was predominantly making sure that you are having the medication.
Sounds simple and straightforward enough. Yeah.
The other challenge there was the way that the organizations and their schemes were set up was seeing these community health workers. They would see the community health workers predominantly as a delivery channel of information, of medication, of service, not as the stakeholders themselves, who have knowledge about people's daily lives, who have knowledge about what it takes for people to take their medication and stay throughout the entire journey. So they're seen as part of the offering. And what we started working with them as users of the system and try to understand not only them as people with expertise as a stakeholder, but also people who are using this entire scheme in their daily lives. Okay. I wake up, I have to decide if I have a target. I have to see 12 patients today. I have to target 12 patients a day. Now, here is the geography that I have to see. Some of these are in rural areas, some of these are in peri-urban areas. Well, peri-urban areas are more dense. I might meet my target easily there. I can find people easier there than I find in rural areas. So all of a sudden, there is a element of decision making on who gets to receive treatment, who doesn't, that were not being considered in the whole treatment process. There was an element of the stress of the community health worker themselves.
Right.
So I have to get on my bike, drive 150 kilometers to visit a patient that I don't know if he or she are going to be there. And upon my return, I might have to deal with a dark road by myself. There might be busy traffic. There might be elephants passing by. Where does that get me to in the state of mind of listening to the user or to the patient and be able to provide the right set of services?
I think I'm seeing what you're saying here. So you're shifting from only thinking about the end user as the person for whom we need a solution, and thinking, well, what are all the other steps along the way that might be preventing that end user from getting it? Let's look at the facilitator and why he or she might not want to make certain decisions that can affect the end user. Interesting.
So there is the shift of the end user in being considered a stakeholder with the lived experiences.
Okay.
There's an expansion of the delivery system, if that is a person, to understand that there's knowledge there too that need to be tapped, and there are hurdles there too that might influence the health outcome.
Personal preferences.
They are not being considered as aspects that need to be designed in the scheme.
Interesting.
And the last one is the people in the back end. So, for example, as you might imagine, here in India, the gender divide gets manifested in many, many, many layers of these schemes. And one of them is the level of comfort between the patient and the provider, right? Now, 2% of the people delivering tuberculosis service in this particular place that we were female. And we were trying to understand why, where the patient population was about 50-50.
Right.
So we were trying to understand what was happening in there. And we learned that one of the policies for being hired in the first place was that you need to own a motorcycle.
Okay.
So that was a criteria that ticks off the possibility of any woman to contribute to the scheme.
Right.
So those three layers of seeing people not as delivery channels, beneficiaries, or even the holders of the problems in the first place, but rather as agents capable of intervening and improving the scheme and potentially redesigning from the get-go, is a good contribution, I think, that design can bring to the development sector.
What I love about this is that you're giving real examples so that we can really understand how a design approach can lead to different solutions. Tell me just for a second, though, because I think that there is a phrase used in this world, design thinking. And quite often, I've been guilty of it myself. Lots of us talk about how design thinking is what you're doing here. And design thinking can lead to solution designs. But design thinking is not really the word we want to use. And why is that? Why do we want to get away from just thinking of it as design thinking?
That's an interesting question. I think that the key point here is to understand that design thinking is a approach, one of the approaches that the field of design has developed. And it was developed for a particular reason, in a particular context, with a particular intention. like many other approaches, like the one that we are exploring developing here, design approaches towards development. So design thinking was an approach that was developed within the context of corporate America to help organizations streamline the adoption of design knowledge and bring that design knowledge into other parts of the organization. So before, design knowledge was predominantly situated within the studio part of the organization, the product development aspect. As that need of understanding who are we designing for started to become more vibrant into the strategic aspect of the organization, they start bringing that knowledge into other parts of the organization, the operation, the strategy, the marketing. Human-centered design emerged as a area of specialization of the field of design, and design thinking became one approach that integrates principles of human-centered design into a commercialized design practice.
Okay.
And that has its value within the particular context.
And presumably it's because of this association with the corporate world and the studio, the one aspect of it, that's not really what we're talking about when we're talking about development design.
Well, and there is an element there that designers do as a way of thinking, and they think as they do. So when you reduce design contributions to the thinking aspect of it, you're leaving out a wealth of knowledge, practice, capabilities that could add value to that particular space. So I think that what we are doing here is not necessarily providing solution. We are shifting from that paradigm of problem solving to shifting the conditions upon which new solutions can be emerged. So that is a key differentiating point here. We are not solving for people, but we are trying to find ways so that people can get involved and solve the problems of their daily life themselves.
I feel like we could go on and on. I have so many other things I want to ask you, but this has been wonderful. I think we'll leave it here. We're going to have a part 2 because there's more we could talk about. I still didn't get to your own personal story, but we'll have that hopefully in the next time that we can meet up with Andre and dig even deeper into the design approach to development. And I love the way that you really brought it home in the end there. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
There'll be more. Thank you so much for watching, listening, and please share this with anybody that you think would be interested in this more holistic bird's eye view and very practical and I think compassionate approach
Definitely.
to development. Thanks a lot.